From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast, and I Hear Everything production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the MarTech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Shapiro, and today we're going to discuss how podcast booking campaigns create value for listeners and for brands. Joining us is Max Novak, who is the founder of Novacast, which is a podcast booking agency for clean tech and SaaS businesses. Novacast carefully crafts podcast booking campaigns to increase strategic visibility, create awesome content, and of course, grow brands' revenues. And today, Max and I are going to talk about whether podcast booking campaigns are actually effective. All right, here's the first part of my conversation with Max Novak, the founder of Novacast. Max, welcome to the MarTech Podcast.
Hi, Benjamin. Pleasure to be here.
Excited to have you on the show. Thank you for calling in all the way from Brussels. We're going to be curious. That is in Belgium, not Austria. My mistake. Apologies for confusing your native country. We're off to a rockin' start here, so let's talk about something that we all know and love, podcasting. Obviously, I'm a little biased, and I think I know what my answer is going to be, but let's hear it from you. Are podcast booking campaigns an effective form of marketing?
Well, yeah, I think you know the answer, but to me, what I've seen is in the beginning, I used to do just podcast bookings. And over time, I saw that 1, 2, 3 bookings weren't very effective. So that's why I really started crafting guesting campaigns of 6 to 12 podcast guest appearances. And I saw that over time was just way more effective than 1 or 2 podcast appearances. It's like being consistent on your social media, let's say LinkedIn, the more the better. But you don't want too much. You just want to keep the quality there.
So you mentioned the keyword, quality. 1 podcast is good, 2 podcasts is better, 1 million podcasts is too much. That all seems logical, but not all podcasts are created equal. Is there a difference between being on one gigantic podcast or a series of smaller podcasts?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say the engagement rate, the bigger the podcast, the lower the engagement or the more difficult it becomes. So smaller podcasts often have a quite loyal audience because they feel they really know the podcast hosts. Although that also tends to appear with bigger podcasts, it just gets a bit more difficult the bigger the podcast gets. So I'd say it's very good to have more smaller podcasts if you target them well. You can have a very big podcast that can be perfectly targeted into your niche. I think it's just a matter of making it a thoughtful connection, not just looking at the size of the audience, but everything in between there.
So it's not just size. This feels very much like what we've talked about on the podcast with our influencer campaigns, where there is a difference between micro and macro. And often when you're doing a series of podcasts or you're working with influencers, smaller the audience, the more engaged, the more loyal, the more direct access to the host or the influencer, as the channel may be. That all makes logical sense. But on the flip side, there's a lot of manual work that goes into being on a podcast. You have to show up. You have to have the conversation. Talk to me about finding the right balance between the show size and the amount of effort you put into a guesting campaign.
Really, the first thing I'd look at is after we make the pitch, let's say, is there a fee to appear on the podcast? Yes or no? And then it's really our job to be like, hey, this amount is worth to appear on the podcast, yes or no. Then there's a lot of things we try to take into account. You know, the social media size, also there's a newsletter. I've seen people with newsletters of 50,000 people who can have less return or revenue from that newsletter than people with newsletters with 5,000 people. So it all depends, and it's not a bad thing to just ask the podcast host, right? It's just having a conversation. In the end, having the podcast interview itself, to me, is the easiest thing. Like we're having now, I just love talking about this. What takes the most time and effort is scheduling everything, sending out the email, and researching the right podcast for yourself. And before that, there's also crafting the right messaging. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to give in terms of value to the audience? So all of those things to me are really a big part of crafting the campaign, right? That's like the beginner steps.
Do you have a sense of how most brands are evaluating podcast guesting campaigns? What's the way that they're turning number of ears or number of listens into actual revenue?
Well, having had lots of conversations with CEOs, founders, and all of that in clean tech and SaaS companies, there's 2 or 3 questions they tend to ask. First is how much effort they have to put in this. To me, it's like the 90 and 10 rule. It's like you put just 10% of your time in it, which is having an initial conversation first. So I get a very good understanding of what you are all about and how you want us to represent your brand without any harm to it, because that's important, not just sending out bulk emails to any podcast host out there. And then also the investment, of course, how much return on investment can they get? And then we get case studies. That can get a little tricky because as a podcast booking agency, you don't get all the metrics of the podcast hosts, right, on the episodes they release. So there's some things who are measurable, and there's also non-measurable aspects such as authority, credibility. What you can measure is how much pieces of content did you put out there? Where did you put them? How much views did you get on them from your website? But credibility isn't something you can measure quite easily.
When I think about podcast guesting, it's very much to me in the PR awareness building type activities. There are metrics that you can evaluate. You're looking at things like brand lift, awareness. You're looking at direct traffic if you want to get into some of the more quantifiable sources. But at the end of the day, this is about having people hear your content. So what is the most effective way when you get on a podcast to start to make sure that you're making a big impact?
So the first thing I'll tell my clients is really like try to sell a conversation, not what you've done over your lifetime. People tend to want to talk about themselves and everything they've done and how difficult their challenges were. And once we shift the focus towards like, hey, try to really just give value of what you've learned to the audience. And that might really interest them. And that's how you'll talk about your business, just like I'm doing now. So let's say we talk about how to not get spammy to podcast hosts to appear on podcasts. That would be my value. That's how you'd get to people saying like, hey, he kind of looks like he knows what he's talking about. Let me check his website. So that's the call to action. So when talking to onboarding clients, one of the important things is where do you want people to go after they've listened to your episode? Because you want to convert listeners into potential buyers if you're selling something, which is often the case. And then, it's really finding the right call to action. Don't get people just to book a call because not a lot of people have the time. So is it just a link towards your LinkedIn? Is it a link towards a free book or a template? So we'll really try to discover what is the best and easiest way for people to get there, because people sometimes are always busy listening to podcasts. You don't want them to fill in a whole questionnaire. You just want a simple, easy link.
At the end of the day, when you're thinking about growing your business, there's a couple different stages you have to go through. You have to build some awareness. You have to have people understand what your brand is, what you're about, the products that you sell. You're doing nurture campaigns, and obviously you're doing your direct response and trying to get everyone to become your customers. Where do you see podcast booking being the most effective? Is it a top of funnel awareness builder? Is it meant to be a nurture activity, or is it something that should actually drive direct sales?
That's a very good question. Well, the way I put it is I like the fact that most of my clients already have a existing marketing campaign. And the way I see it is that you cannot just build a company and have a podcast guesting campaign. To me, a podcast guesting campaign will support a already existing and ongoing marketing campaign. So yes, it will help in creating brand awareness because you get to talk to new audiences in a very natural way and a very authentic way, which people will obviously like. And there's not a whole selling aspect inside of it. And that's what really is attracting to people. And then you can repurpose that on your social media, which will really strengthen your brand awareness and lead generation. So I think they really come well together, because with podcasting, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You create content, you can create brand awareness, and you can speak your message in an organic way.
You know, one of the biggest benefits of podcasting is it humanizes brands. A podcast cannot be executed by a brand. A podcast guesting campaign can't be executed by a brand. It has to be a member of the organization. And it's one of the ways to humanize what you're doing. The more you're trying to reach out to customers, reach out to prospects, the more that they want to understand the people behind the podcast, the people behind your brand, the people behind the products that they're going to purchase. And when you think about whether you should do a podcast or not, I think you need to think about how human your brand is. One of the biggest benefits from podcasting is that the people that are listening get to know you, get to know the people behind the brand, not just the logo. And that wraps up this episode of the Martech Podcast. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Max Novak, the founder of Novacast. In part 2 of this interview, which we're going to publish tomorrow, Max and I talk about tech-driven ways to get on podcasts. If you can't wait until our next episode and you'd like to learn more about Max, you can find a link to his LinkedIn profile in our show notes, or you can visit his company's website, which is novacast.be. That's Novacast.be. Just one more link in our show notes I'd like to tell you about. If you didn't have a chance to take notes while you were listening to this podcast, head over to martechpod.com, where we have summaries of all of our episodes and contact information for our guests. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can even send us your topic suggestions or your marketing questions, which we'll answer live on our show. Of course, you can always reach out on social media. Our handle is martechpod, MARTECHPOD, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or you can contact me directly. My handle is Ben J. Shap, BenJShap. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you want a daily stream of marketing and technology knowledge in your podcast feed, we're going to publish an episode every day this year. So hit the subscribe button in your podcast app and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. All right, that's it for today. But until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.